Hello, people. This week I read, what is this? The Other Queen. Is that coming up good? The Other Queen by Philippa Gregory. This is, what do we say? Historical fiction. And that is where somebody will get something, a setting usually of, stuff that happened and then make a story out of it. So you would be in, I don't know, like 18th century France, and those are your rules, and then you do all this other stuff in that setting. This is what our author does. She does it very well. Okay, I guess there's a few ways you could do this. One being, like I use the setting, right? Like, what is it? Cowboys and Indians. Cowboys and Aliens. Where the rules are cowboy, and then I add aliens, and it makes for a fun action movie, right? So you can really play with it, but you could also be like very historically accurate. And this is what our author does. Obviously, the things in this book you can't say are historical. They're not factual in that sense. They couldn't be from what we get. But she's so good at it that I'd be willing to wager. I haven't looked, but I bet she could actually write a history book. That's how well she knows the era and the people involved in the era. So, know that going in. First thing you notice in the book, first thing, page 1, you crack it open. And it's usually very worrisome for me. There's no prologue. There's not even chapter names. Right? What we do is each chapter is from a different character's point of view. And we're using first person point of view, which is tricky. First person point of view being, I reach for the book. I pick it up. I accidentally hit my microphone, right? You're describing all of the things that you do. I've seen this go sideways so many times in books where a few things will happen. One, the author will lose track of the inner monologue, right? The inner voice. And you'll start to describe things you shouldn't describe, or look at things you wouldn't look at, or monologue in weird ways that you wouldn't internally, because it's a person's thoughts. In a weird way, it's almost like pure dialogue, right? Where everything you're writing is from this one perspective constantly. Like it's that when you speak, it's dialogue, but when you're not speaking, it's still internal dialogue, if that makes sense. That's almost what it seems like sometimes you have to do. So I can't then, if it's me, right, and I'm the first person narration, I can't then be, let's say, thinking things I'm not thinking. Like, what are you talking about? I know where I live. I'm used to the things around me. It's second nature to grab my toothbrush. It's second nature to pull my door and not push it open. You know what I mean? I'm not actively thinking of those things as I move about my day. So in books that aren't as good, they spend time, because at some point you want to describe the world and move me through it as a reader. They'll spend time as that character describing things that character would not be describing. And then it starts to break apart. They lose track of it. Okay, so it is difficult. Second, it starts to be difficult just in general to give different people in a book voice. So some will be in first person. I've semi lost track of the train of thought I'm having, but then we get to the dialogue, and the dialogue doesn't sound like different people. This book doesn't do any of that. This book is fantastic. And then the use of the first person is also fantastic. So our author here doesn't just use one person. She picks 3 people. And constantly, chapter by chapter, switches between them. It's Bess, George, Talbot, and Mary, Queen of Scots. Now, if you know, just by those names, you already know. Historically, Mary, Queen of Scots, very famous. It's 15th century-ish England, I believe. Let me see. 1569, August, Wingfield Manor, Mary. Very specific. Now, some of the settings she can be specific on because we know them from history. Maybe she took liberties. I'm not exactly sure. I'm not, I don't have that mess memorized. I'm sure these places exist. Were these people there at this time? I'm not sure. Could have been. But it's one of these things. In any case, it feels extremely real. But she gets 3 different perspectives. And then the use of these perspectives is genius. Through Bess. Bess is the wife, the Countess of George Talbot, who's been charged with watching the Queen of Scotland, Mary, Queen of Scots. I'll get into sort of the story in a second. I like just the use of this first person. I couldn't get over. Through Bess, we get a sense of a countess's duties, of what it means to run a house, of what it means to, tapestries, carpets, rugs, clothes, curtains, what it takes to rebuild one of these manors, what it's like to be inside of them, what it's like to deal with, right? So if you see like the Downton Abbey, right, the show, fake, all right, but it's a big house. Those weren't just, I'm rich, I live here. They were rich, they did live there. But the idea was that it's part of an estate and it has numerous employees. The point was to employ people, right? So you're a big lord, yeah, you're rich, but you then are sort of duty-bound societally to employ X amount of people, yada, yada. So there's a lot of responsibility just attached to it versus, nowadays where you're just rich and you can go do rich guy stuff, which is whatever you want. But that through a first person, I found that we found a person who can reasonably be thinking of these things. He's constantly thinking of the expense of having this Queen of Scots as her guest, the trouble when you move from one of those places to another. You have to, it's hauling plates of silver, candlesticks, rugs, sofas, paintings. You throw them on a wagon and trudge them through the mud, whatever miles it is to the next place, right? When they left those houses, it'd just be barren. You can't just show up there. You'd have to show up, set it up nice so it looks good, start a fire to get the damp out, etc. Right? We see all of this through one person's actual living it. I'm living it with the person. Food. Right? You don't think about it, but she has trouble in some spots buying fresh fruits, fresh foods, because when you go from one place to the next, for reasons. There's no like Walmart in that town, right? It's the 15th century. She has to get coins, go to town or send a guy to town and say, get me these things. Then he comes back and like, they have it, but they're not selling it to us. They're uninclined. I almost paid triple and they still wouldn't. Now, obviously, for an obscene amount of money, maybe you could, but maybe you couldn't. Maybe winners come in and they're like, I'm not selling my food at all. I need it to eat. And so you're now scraping along in this other manner. Through Beth, we see all of this, all the inner workings of the estate manor life, on top of, how it would be to house an important person. Through George, her husband. What is it? George shows us the day-to-day of sort of these lords. What is it? What did he say? Names like Westmoreland, Northumberland, Thomas Howard. Famous names. Northumberland, I believe, is a place. But in England, a lot of those places are named after dudes, right? So at some point in history, Northumberland was a dude. And not only was it a dude, it was his friend. He personally knew him. He grew up with him, right? So they're all rich, but it's tightly knitted like this. So from him, I get to see that interaction. You see, what is it? They are mad about a man named Cecil because he's a commoner, essentially, to them, advising the queen. And in his mind, it should be the nobles, that they've done it for generations and they should continue to do it. And England will be better off if they do. So they try and, sort of bring them down a peg. Politics. But it's like a personalized family politics, if that makes sense. Through him, you get a sense of, and I make that point because it is a big point to these people. It's a big point in the plot of the book, but it was a big point to these people. Sometimes it wasn't just the best person for the job. It was the best noble, right? And on the one hand, you say, that's not good. On the other hand, they would say, I think Winston Churchill said that on the whole, throughout history, that aristocratic way may have got the most done. And I'm like, I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, they didn't get to space. We got to space, right, with freedom. But you look at too much into politics and you start to go, maybe it would work better if these people cared on a personal family level and were judged like that. I'm not sure. It is interesting to see, though. But more importantly for this book, it's interesting to experience. Because that's what you do with first person. You start to experience it. He gives us a feel for inside sort of the Queen Elizabeth's court. This is where the queen sits and then all these lords who know each other show up. So it turns into a social / governmental affair. Obviously, then we also get great descriptions of suits of armor, of paintings on walls, of guards, of, the cobblestone streets of London, blah, this kind of thing. The river Thames. And again, it doesn't clash from his perspective. Because she chose to use different people, she can now reasonably point out different descriptors, not break the milieu, fancy word, and the book just moves forward. And of course you're a reader. Of course you remember what Bess was saying descriptively and what George says descriptively, and you add them in your mind as you move forward. So you never have a sense of not seeing where you are or feeling what it feels like to be there. It's very, very cool. And then last, of course, we have Mary, Queen of Scots. What Mary gives us is insight into the French court. I think at one point she said it was her, when she was a child, her and 4 other kids. And there were 35 musicians there just to play just for them in this, garden. That's how she was raised. She shows me some of the Scottish court. To her, raised in the French court, might as well be barbarians. They're very rough, crass, forward, headstrong. I'm like, okay. And, Edinburgh. I think it's Edinburgh Castle. I'm not sure. I know it's in Edinburgh. She's in some castle. Bolton's Castle, something like this. I don't remember the name. But she's in one of their castles, and I can feel that it's darker. Not like there's less sunlight. Clearly, outside is green and bright. I can almost see the dark stone they used. It might be what is it? It actually might be older than the French castle she was in. They built new stuff. They'd be in fancy modern stuff. The Scottish people were in some ancient stuff. She also gives you a great sense of what it means to these people to be royal. She walked around like she was half divine, literally. Like her life, her being, her existence is the will of God. That even if she messes up, her royal blood means it's not a mess up. Or that she'll be, insta-forgiven or something like this, right? But she carries herself like that, right? She's like the perfect queen. Always prim, always proper, always the best angles. Beautiful, elegant. She mesmerizes all the men around her. Even Bess, who has reasons to not like her, starts to like her. Right? She's, what did they say? She's a queen 3 times over. I think by marriage, she's a queen of France. And by birth, by bloodline, she's the queen of both Scotland and England. So in a weird way, she had a claim, legitimate, to 3 different thrones of Europe. Right? It also gives us sort of their movements. By they, I mean royalty, literally. At some point, I don't think it says it specifically in this book, but you get a sense of it, where country loses crown, right? The person eats it, dies. The royals just look around and are like, Ted's the best, closest relation to them. He could be king. And they ask him. And he's like, no, okay, I'll do it. Then they send this dude. He'll be from Belgium or from wherever. And now he's in Poland. Right? Or from Belgium to Scotland or Wales or something like this, right? They'll just move. Show up and then they're king. You have people from Austria becoming kings of Spain. They don't speak the language. Weird kind of stuff like this starts to happen. It's almost silly in some respects. But that's exactly how it functioned at the time. And it's cool, again, it's cool to see it in person. And everything else that happens is from that. The story. Mary, Queen of Scots. Oh, Lord. So some of this isn't in our book, but it's mentioned. But what happens is she's young. 21, I think. And she's sent to Scotland to be the Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots. She's in charge. But of course, any kind of rule has issues. You have to deal with lords. Was she the greatest at this? Probably not. She married a guy named Darnley, I believe. But then he got killed. And then her Spanish advisor, Rizzio, got killed. Then she married a man named Bothwell, Scottish. She really liked him, according to this book, right? Again, a lot of these are debatable. Then he gets captured, and he's in jail in Belgium the whole time of this book. But then she YOLO's out of there before she thinks they're going to kill her. At least she's not sure about it. In her mind, in her mind, she'll go to England, where her cousin Queen Elizabeth, a fellow queen, will see her plight, give her an army. With that army, she'll go back, kill the people who killed her people, recapture the throne of Scotland. Everything will be good. That's what's in her head. That's not what happens. She gets to England, just gets sent right to sort of imprisonment. And then you're like, why? The why goes down to Protestant versus Catholic. Huge issue in the 15th century. Why? Well, like, they weren't friendly. So the Catholic would be in charge, and the Catholics are, you say Mass in Latin. The Pope is sacred. The wine they present in their ceremonies is literally sacred. You're not allowed to read the Bible because you need a priest. And then, of course, on the back end, there's a lot of tithes that go to these priests. They have a lot of money, etc. Right? So we're like, well, that's fine. Well, then a Protestant gets in charge. And the Protestants are like, nah, you can read your own Bible. You can say Mass in English. The wine is just wine from wherever. It's not, you can spill it on the ground. You're not going to get struck by lightning. And why should we listen to the Pope when I can read the Bible and just listen to what the Bible says? Right? So they did that. Then a Protestant got back in charge because, again, these kings are old and die quickly, or however this goes. Some get kicked out, etc. Well, when the Catholics got back in charge, they're like, you're a dirty heretic. And I think I'm going to burn you burn you on the cross. I'm like, what? So that's what they started doing. This is real history. This is why they were burning people. And they wouldn't just stop at burning, right? They would ostracize, they would take your land, they would take your stuff. So then, of course, when the Protestants get back in charge, they start taking the stuff back. And once you start taking, you'll take a little more. Our best, they keep mentioning the candlesticks, but it again, it's a good example of Queen Elizabeth's in charge. She doesn't care what religion you have, essentially. I think she's a Protestant, but it's most important to her to not have a Catholic on the throne because they start burning people. So with Queen Elizabeth in charge, Bess and her former husband can raid these churches, take this gold, enrich themselves. And literally the candlesticks on her table were from a church somewhere. So for her perspective, if things go south, they're going to do her dirty because here are golden candlesticks from a church. Right? So you start to see it, again, the personal of these issues. That's the big issue. So we imprison a Mary, Queen of Scots, because she's a Catholic. And she's the most strong-willed queen you could have. And they're like, would you just be okay with Protestants? And she's like, yeah, I'd be okay with them. As long as they burn for the heretics that they are. Right? So, this guy named Cecil, advisor to the Queen of England, literally just sort of doesn't let her move about. And what he doesn't want to happen is almost sort of what happens. There's a half of England who, for X amount of centuries, has been Catholic. And they want to go back to Catholicism. And they then latch on to Mary, Queen of Scots, as the way to get back to that. So the North, they constantly say the North uprises. Thomas Howard, a lord, falls in love with her, wants to marry her. He's obviously thinking I could become King of England and maybe King of Scotland. So it's a bit of a power play too. But then we have, Norfolk. Again, a lot of these are places in England, but they were also people, which is cool to me. uprises. I'm going to bring an army. As he's marching along down through the north of England, towns are capitulating. People are just buying into whatever he says. His army's getting big, and they're just walking through everything. But we're seeing it from George, who's loyal to his queen, and Bess with the candlesticks, worried about this army that could just show up over a hill because they're holding Mary, Queen of Scots. And if this army gets her, it's done for. It's like the One Ring getting back to Sauron. They'll just have this figurehead that's mesmerizing, and there's no way she won't win. Right? So we constantly, we'll load up these wagons and be rushing off to another safer place, constantly back and forth. Does anything end up happening? No. But in the moment, we get to live those moments with these characters. I love this book for that. Now, I say nothing happens, because when you take a quick overview of the history, which I knew going in, it does seem like that. It seems like there was an uprising that moved about, then sputtered away, and then nothing ended up happening. Again, from the inside, it's a lot more dramatic. I like it this way better. And that's sort of what happens. We spend a lot of time swapping between our three characters, thinking of what aftermath might happen, of Mary constantly dreaming of the Northern Army showing up and just rescuing her. What was supposed to happen is the Pope was going to excommunicate Queen Elizabeth. Then the Spanish were going to send a fleet from Dutchland right over to England. And then with that army, paired with the army of the North, they'd go save the Queen of Scots, rule everything. So these people, these Norfolk, instead of getting to Mary, Queen of Scots, they decide to go to the port and wait for the boats, the armies, the Spanish armies. The Spanish armies were waiting for the people on land to get a big victory before they roll up in. So when they get there and don't see any boats, they're like, well, this is done, and they just sort of give up. They just disperse. And that's how it goes. I mean, Queen Elizabeth sort of wins without even trying to win. It's kind of genius. And then it all falls apart for Mary, Queen of Scots. In that regard, Norfolk gets captured. He's forgiven. Now, what Cecil does is forgives everyone with promises. Right? I'm forgiving you this time. Don't do it again. And he gets promises from everyone. And especially from a Mary, Queen of Scots, right? So she then of course tries to break her promise. She tries to get Norfolk to come back and, try it again with a different setup. They all get captured, of course, because they're goobers. And what is it? I think they were going to send some Spanish gold, but they just sent it, in a satchel instead of with a personal courier that's loyal. And everything, the whole plot gets blown up. Cecil has spies everywhere. Cecil's a genius. Now, again, I'm describing the events, but as they happen, the good and the bad, because for a time, the Queen Elizabeth's side doesn't know if they're going to win. Every time these things happen, you have to remember, you start to feel the loss through Bess or George, and you feel the elation through Mary. And then when it reverses, the feelings reverse. And even at the end, you really end up feeling sympathy for all of them. George ends up having to put his friend on trial because he's just honor bound. Now what ends up happening, George falls in love with Mary because she's too mesmerizing. But he's a lord and full of honor. So his confliction is, honor between his heart and his duties and his wife. He doesn't actually cheat on his wife. Let's not get that twisted. But in his mind, he kind of does, right? And that's enough. Of course, her wife then hates Mary for taking to her husband, but she also hates her because she's expensive and ruining all their money. So by the end, they're almost bankrupt. And she's able to get back her lands because in the 15th century, women can't own land. They have to give it all to their husband. In a big legalese, she gets it back. Very happy for her about that. It's a big deal. What is it? She calls it Chatsworth. It's a big deal to have these estates, especially for her. But in that time, your Queen of Scots just gets like they want to send her, even with the failed invasion. They can't see a way. Cecil can't see a way to not send her back to Scotland. And he's sure if she goes back to Scotland, the same crap's going to happen again. She's going to try and build an army. At some point, she's going to want to take the throne. At some point, her kid will inherit the throne, and he'll be Catholic, and we'll be back to burning people. So what he does is like harsh terms. So he says, okay, you can go, but we're keeping your kid. So you have to promise, you have to renounce the throne of England, and you don't get to raise your kid. And right, he keeps tacking things on that's going to be a lot for her to deal with. And on top of promising not to send any more letters out to start any more mess, which she says yes to. But then that was a lie. And then the moment that George catches her in that lie, it's just like, you promised as a queen. And for him, he can't get over that you would dishonor the essence of a queen by lying. And it sort of breaks his heart, but he still loves her. This kind of heartbroken moment for him. And then the slickest thing they do, because if you know the story, it doesn't happen instantly. It happens after some years. They can't kill her because she's a queen. And the Queen Elizabeth has no jurisdiction over her. Other than if at some point she says, let's kill Queen Elizabeth. Which she doesn't do until years later. Well, instead of going through all those meandering years, our author gives George a dream of the execution sequence sort of as it happens. It's a very slick way to get you to the end of the story without having to end the story there, if that makes sense. We end sort of with where we started with Bess. Triumphant. She lost Chatsworth, but she ends up with a newer, bigger estate that's even better. So that's really cool. But that was the slickest part to me, that we use a dream sequence to show you. Because in the end, Mary Queen of Scots gets her old head chopped off. This is true. They did not want to risk this Catholic uprising. So they chopped her head off. You're like, well, that sucks for her. It did. But her kid, I believe, ends up being King of England and Scotland. So, lineally, I guess it worked out. But she was always going to get her head chopped off. She was the perfect queen, right? And part of that means you just have this unconquerable pride about yourself. You're just really about it. You will not relent. You cannot relent. I mean, she could have if she were smart, right? If she read Machiavelli more than once, she could have relented, ruled Scotland, and been fine. Well, possibly fine. She might have got assassinated there too. Who knows? But she really was unbending. And that's The Other Queen. This is a tremendous book, people. Go check it out. Ad time? I gotta get this edited quick. I'm already kind of late for reasons. Reasons being I had to chop down a tree. But that's a different story for a different day. These are my stories. If you buy them, I'll get loots, and that'll help the channel. Or you can subscribe. I suppose that'll help the channel. Or you can just like the video. That'll help. Or you can just watch. I'm fine. Either way. Okay. I'll see you people next week.